All right, everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Metal and Forge podcast, a weekly podcast discussing manhood, entrepreneurship, American life, and matters of the soul. I'm here with Austin Lapp and Patrick Miller. I'm going to get to you guys in just 1 second, but first, why Metal and Forge? Well, metal, a new word for me, a person's ability to cope well with difficulties and facing demanding situations in a spirited and resilient way. So that is why metal. And forge, well, I think forge is what you allow yourself to turn into over time. And one thing that we want to say on the front end, go to mettleandforge.com. Metal is METTLE, mettleandforge.com to submit topics, questions, general, thoughts. We take it all. But if you guys have questions you want to hear us discuss on this podcast, go to mettleandforge.com. We got a little form fill there for you. You can do it anonymously. We can put your name down. We don't really care what you do. We just want to hear from you. Okay, Patrick Miller and Austin Lapp, welcome back. Episode 2. We're just getting going on this thing. We're going to try to do weekly podcasts. How you guys feeling? How was your week? And here's a question for you guys. What's one thing about each of you that most people might not know? Austin Lapp. Kick it over to you, my man. By the way, let's just say we have the same last name, but there's no close relation that we're aware of.
That's right.
That you know of.
Oh, there's relation. Don't get me wrong. There's relation.
How many cousins in between kind of thing. What's one thing that most people don't know about me? I've been thinking about this. I don't think most people know that I'm actually ordained. I can marry people. And I have.
No kidding. I did not know that.
Yep. I was ordained a couple years ago as the worship pastor of our church, and I just kind of I don't preach a lot. I don't really walk around with a badge and don't like to, but it has allowed me to do two really cool weddings. And I guess I'm advertising it here, but I'm not, because I don't really see myself as the marrying kind or even someone who preaches a whole lot, but that's probably one thing most people don't know about me.
Well, Patrick didn't know about you. But Austin, I will say, I know you're not advertising yourself here, but I will say, I know you're pretty dang well. And I think for the right wedding, you would be a hell of a pastor. I think you'd have a lot of fun with that. So if someone's looking for a great pastor to get married, I think I would put your name forward. Patrick, how about you?
Hey, I've had a good week. It started off with a bang, and something that people probably don't know about me, a few of you may know, but I spent 2 years living outdoors back in the year 2000, 98 to 2000 in South Carolina. I was a counselor at a boys camp and lived outdoors in a therapeutic wilderness camping type of setup. So we did group therapy for emotionally handicapped boys, and we lived out in the woods and cut down trees, built our own cabins, cooked our own food. We also had a chuck wagon where we went to eat sometimes, but I spent 2 years living outside, and I would say it shaped me a great deal. So
my brother was at that same camp, right, Patrick? Was that at Fairplay?
That's right.
Yeah, what an intense experience. I have a lot of respect for guys that go through that. You were there to change the lives of kids, but I have to imagine it had a pretty big impact on you also.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to the extent that I've been able to be a good dad, I give a lot of credit to my experience at Fairplay.
Wow. Okay, fun times. Well, I'm really stoked to be doing this podcast with you guys over some period of time here, because I think the world of both of you, and I'm looking forward to others getting in to the inside of you guys' brains also. But if you guys are good, let's just jump right into it. We got a couple of spicy topics on the docket today that aren't going to serve themselves, so let's go for it. Okay, the first one, I want to talk a little bit about the utility of education in modern America. And I'm going to actually set this one up and kind of go the inverse of probably how we'll roll in the next two topics. I think I want to get you guys' thoughts first, but I think let me set this one up, if it's okay with you guys, and I'll kind of talk through my point of view here on this one and what I'm seeing out there, and then get you guys' thoughts, and then let's bat it around. So the utility of education in modern America, I'm particularly thinking here about college and high school. And this is something that is being talked about increasingly so. And however, most of the time it's being talked about, it is being talked about around the idea of college in particular. Okay. So I'm tipping my hand here a little bit, but I have not heard it talked about at all in terms of like the value of the high school experience. Okay. And so we'll come back to that a little bit more. But what I have been hearing a lot more talk about, and I would say the last decade, last decade, but half decade for sure, where more people from more backgrounds and more cultures are starting to second guess and question the value of 2 years or 4 years in college if you don't particularly know what you're there for. And I think, the one thing that we can say up front is clearly there are plenty, and not just a few, but plenty of professions where you're going to want to go to college, you're going to need to go to college, et cetera, right? I mean, this is just super obvious, but, doctors, lawyers, CPAs, we can go, there's a huge list of careers, life tracks, if you will, where you're going to want to go to college. And out of that category, most of them, you're going to have to go to college. Okay. So we're not so much talking about that. I think if you want to be a doctor, there's your answer. You got lots of education before you, and thank God. But if you're not so sure, and I think what I'm particularly speaking to is this idea that we've been sold over the last several decades, probably longer, the idea that in school, you get into a sport, probably multiple sports, you use that sport, you excel in one particular sport so that you can get into college that you wouldn't necessarily be able to afford, but you leverage the sports for scholarship, and then you get into a college, as good a college as possible, and then use that college degree to get a great job. And then once you get that great job, start working your way up the corporate ladder. And the idea is that your influence and your income in particular will increase over time. That whole thing as a template, as a pattern for society, as a best practice, as common wisdom, in my observation, is really starting to fall apart. And I'll give you guys one example. We sell Amish-made buildings at Amish Co. And this started really this winter. Let's just say the first half of this year, okay? The first half of 2024, I had half a dozen parents that are in their 50s and 60s come in, and all half dozen of them said the same thing, except for one. They said that we have a 25-year-old son. He is renting an apartment, and what he's doing for work is paying his apartment barely, and that's about it. His ability to buy a house there's no light at the end of the tunnel for this person buying a house. These kids are, and by kids, mid to upper 20s with a job. They're responsible and dependable, and they have a job. Now, what was that job? I don't know. I have to assume some of those jobs included stocking shelves at Kroger. I think one was an electrician, possibly. But I do think when they weren't necessarily elite level jobs or like super high income paying jobs, but in their defense, no one's saying that that's what you're going to need on the other end of a college degree to make it work for you. They're saying this is the way. This is the way that that it works for most people. And they all basically said, 25 years old, have a job. It's not working. And the apartment is too expensive. And no, look, keep in mind, this is in Nashville. Okay. So this might not be the case everywhere. But their question was, how much could we pay for a tiny home to put in our backyard so our grown son can come live in our backyard and not pay $2,000 or $3,000 a month in rent? maybe kick the parents however much money per month, and use that as a reset and use that to get ahead. Only one of these 50 or 60-year-old parents said that in this case, it was a 30-year-old son, was a deadbeat. And there's nothing you can do for that. A tiny home isn't going to fix that. That's his own problem. That's not what I'm talking about. So that was an interesting data point. My wife grew up Amish. I grew up Mennonite. Austin and I grew up the exact same way. We were basically Amish adjacent. Well, actually, Patrick, you did too, I think. But Austin and I went to the same church, and we actually went to the same school. And the way that we did it, and Austin, chime in if you would speak differently about this, but in our friend group, our social circles or whatever, everyone went to 12th grade. It's what you did. And, all those years ago, there was even a couple of us, your brother being one of them, another couple of our friends that went and got an associate's degree, did some community college for a couple of years, got some degrees that way. And that was uncommon, but it wasn't completely unheard of. But everyone went to high school, everyone went, got that 12th, got that high school degree, high school diploma. So that was my experience growing up. Was, of course, you're going to go through 12 years, and you may or may not go additional years into college. And so my wife grew up actually Amish, and of course, people can probably guess what that looks like, and that looks like going to 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, but probably 8th grade, and getting out of school. And the way the Amish, one of the ways that's very common in the Amish community is they are highly entrepreneurial, and it's very common for the dad to have some sort of a business or businesses. The mom's probably involved with something also, and the kids get out of school early, 8th grade, 9th grade, whatever it looks like, come work with the dad in business, get that early income going, get that life experience, and sort of like get your high school education in the real world. It's sort of how it works in real life. And so that's how they do it. So that was our experience when we moved to Nashville 10 years ago. I would have thought for probably half of the 10 years that we lived in Nashville that we would actually encourage probably all of our kids to go to college. That was my thinking when we moved down here. And, if it was clear that there was not going to be utility in any one of them going to college, I don't think even 10 years ago I would have thought like, I'm going to force them to do it. But the thinking was, do we encourage our kids to go to college or don't we? And my thinking of about probably 60 or 70% of the time that we've lived here in Nashville now was that we would actually encourage them to go to college. And my thinking started to really, I guess I started to really wonder if that was the right way to go about things. Thankfully, we have plenty of time. Our oldest is, well, he's super young, actually. He's in 14, but he is in 9th grade. So I guess in some way we don't have a lot of time here. But still, we have several years, right, until we're thinking about colleges. So we have plenty of time on this. And I guess I started to notice a few things. I will probably say the one thing that really did start to raise some questions for me probably was around COVID, where you started to kind of see how the education system sort of worked behind the scenes and what their values indeed seemed to be. And then you start hearing more about the rot at these elite universities, the internal rot. And then you start to hear, I think some of the way this stuff tends to work is like trickle down. Then you start to hear like, the wealthy people start to publicly question whether it's worth it or not to go to an Ivy League school. And, maybe it's just as good to go to a really good other than Ivy League school, and you can sort of accomplish the same things, and maybe you don't get so programmed. And so you start to hear that. And then, you do start to hear, I think there is a lot more people questioning. I am hearing over the last several years, a lot more people questioning the utility or the value in, or even the wisdom in going to college just for the sake of going to college. I'm starting to hear that a lot. And I also think that there was just this thing of like not wanting to rush to any particular opinion or personal philosophy on this front, and allow it some time to play out. And it has been interesting on a whole bunch of fronts, growing up the way that we grew up, myself and my wife in particular. And then boom, moving to Nashville. When we moved down here, we didn't know anyone. So you're just dropped into a whole other culture, which we love and became home for us immediately. We love it here, but it's a very different thing, right? I mean, it is. And so getting to kind of experience that for a decade and starting to see patterns and develop some I guess develop some thought patterns based on the patterns you're seeing in real life. And one of the things that I was noticing more recently was a couple things. But I guess the one thing would be the programming that seems to be going on in a lot of colleges right now. But I don't tend to be sort of afraid of the culture, right? So I don't know. Maybe I should be more scared on that front, but that's not the biggest deal to me. But what I am seeing, I guess, the most has to do with, we use money as an exchange of value, and that's not going away. That's just a thing. And the ratios, I guess the way money works now is very different than it worked in the 80s. It's different than it worked in the 90s, and things have really changed. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is, I think in the 90s, I don't know if the 80s in particular, I don't know that any of those half dozen 50 or 60-year-old parents that came into my office and said their 25-year-old son, who is responsible, who does show up to work, who has a job, I feel like they could be doing those exact same things 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, and it would have worked for them. But things have changed now. The dollar isn't, it's just the ratios are off now, and with and on a whole bunch of fronts. I don't want to, if I say inflation, that's the only thing we're going to think of, but that is one of the things, but it has to do with more than that. Like, even if you were to compare like the average income to the average cost of education in the 80s and 90s, that would be way different than the average income and the average cost of education in 2024. Okay, so that's just one example. So what it does seem like is there's a lot of employers out there that do not care whether you have a high school degree or not. And I think you guys probably know a bunch of them, and I know a bunch of them. And the ones that I know around Nashville are not Amish or Mennonite. They never have been, and they still don't care. And they would be great places to work. And I don't know that, at too many of them, unless you work your way up, which you absolutely could do. But I don't know that you're necessarily going to become wealthy super quick working there, but it's going to be a good job, and it's going to pay a lot more than Kroger. And you don't have to have a high school or a college degree. So those are a couple things. And then the other thing that I don't know what to do with, and I do not want it to sound negative on anybody, because first of all, even academia, if you want to get into education, is needed for a lot more than doctors and lawyers. If you want to get into academia at some level, teaching, professor, you got to have the education, and some of those areas do not necessarily pay well, and people know that going in, and that's totally fine. It's their life choice. But one of the things, this is highly anecdotal, but one of the things that I was thinking a lot about this summer and looking for exceptions to this, and there are absolutely plenty of exceptions, but the rule of thumb in the people that we know is there almost does seem to be this direct inverse correlation between the amount of education someone has and their net worth. The higher their education, the lower their net worth, and the lower their education, the higher their net worth. And I want to quickly say also that is not the ultimate deciding, that is not the ultimate value to place on someone, right, is their net worth. But we are talking about the value of education, and we are talking about income. We are talking about making it in this life. So net worth and income, those are two separate things, but sometimes related. That is what we're talking about. So if there is this direct and inverse correlation between the amount of one's education and their net worth, that is something that I have to pay attention to. Look, the entrepreneurial Amish way of things is not that education is not valuable. Their idea is that formal education is probably a lot less valuable than you might think, and education is extremely important, and it is a lifetime or a lifelong process. And you need to continue to learn. You need to learn on your feet. You need to adapt, and you need to hustle on that front. And it does seem to work most of the time. I do have to say that it does seem to work most of the time. And so this is a long wind up to say we're in the past, I was thinking about, do I encourage or mandate college for my kids? Over the last year, I've actually moved that consideration to high school. And I know that's going to make me sound like a lunatic. And I also want to acknowledge that I tend to be an early adapter. And in a lot of cases, I can be too early. And so I do feel like this is one area where I'm probably a little early. And what I mean by that is if we do not make our kids go to high school, most people will not understand. And it could be in 10 or 20 years from now, we'll know then. We won't know before then. It could be that they were right, and I should have made all my kids go to high school. But I have sort of landed on the idea that I am not going to force the kids to go to high school, and I'm going to leave it up to them. And I'm also going to make it highly individualized in our recommendation or in our mandates. And so the oldest one is the one that, quite frankly, of probably all of the five, I would be most comfortable with him having an early exit out of high school and getting into the real world. And I also want to say I did feel different about this when I had a W-2 income a couple of years ago. There is something different about owning your own business, having something for, your boy to get involved with you. And the thinking here is, he could come out of high school, maybe he could do 9th and 10th grade, and he could have an income for 2 years when otherwise he would have no income, and we would be spending, X per year. So then, he's got 2 years of income that he would not have otherwise had. And now we've got a little lump of cash, and now we can buy a house, when all of his friends are just getting out of high school. Pros and cons. I talked to someone in the Amish and Mennonite community to get their thought on this, and this past summer, and their thought was, agreed on all fronts. They really have no problem with it. The one thing they did say was they were youth leaders in the Amish and Mennonite circles. You will vote someone in to be like the youth pastors, if you will. And it's usually a couple that does it together. Sometimes there's more than one couple and they partner up on it, but there's like a couple that's in charge. And they had been youth leaders for a number of years. And the one thing that they had said was what they did notice was the kids at their church that stayed in high school and did not drop out early tended to have a closer knit community with the youth group at church. And the kids that dropped out at 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade tended to not be as integrated with youth group at church, and they made friends in other areas that were sometimes did have a negative impact on them. And so his thought was, from an income standpoint, everything else I'm saying he would agree with, but he did see value in staying in high school for that community and not feeling like an outsider with your youth group, with the thinking here that, your friends are going to be better if you're more integrated in your church youth group. And so that, I think, is a pretty strong argument. And, I want to pay attention to that. So to summarize, where we've landed is we're going to take it kid by kid. And I have switched my thinking in the last 6 months from, okay, definitely going to go to high school, because again, Austin, you and I growing up, I don't know what you're thinking on that, but in my opinion, or in my thinking back then, not finishing high school was absolutely unheard of. This is crazy talk. It's lunacy. everyone must go to high school. Good grief, what are we going to do? Like churn our own butter and knit our own clothes also? Like, this is insane. But we will take it kid by kid. But if the conditions are right, I'm not going to force them to go to high school, because I think that you can continue learning in the real world. Money is different now, and having that extra 2 years of income is a nice step to get ahead. And if you can get ahead at an early age in this life financially, there can be benefits down the road. What do you guys think? Patrick, I'm going to kick it to you, because actually I'm really curious to hear your perspective on this, because you actually have a kid in a really, really good university. And so you kind of have this diversity of experience that I'm interested to hear from. So Patrick, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll kick it over to Austin.
We've got a lot of different experience across this question. We have a daughter who has an associate degree from a community college. We have a son at Vanderbilt University, second year student at Vandy. And we have a high school senior in a public school. And we have a homeschool sophomore and a 4-month-old. And we have done homeschooling for all the kids at some point. We've sent them to public school, to private school. And so we pretty much have the whole gamut experience. I personally only went through 10th grade. I got my GED and called it a day. So that was my education in as far as formal education goes. I think you're right to point out that things are changing rapidly, and the rules of the game are changing along with the reality on the ground. I think I'm generally I would come from your point of view on this, Kent, which is it's a case-by-case thing. So my son, who is at Vanderbilt University, he is gifted in that context. He's good at school. He's good at playing that game. And I don't mean to denigrate it in any way by calling it a game. I'm just saying he's got the skills to perform well in that context, And so having the opportunity to go to an elite university and having most of the funding provided by the university for that, then it makes sense for him to go. Would I spend $90,000 a year to pay the going rate for Vandy for any of my kids? No. I mean, it's just $90,000 a year for an education is not, so times 4, you're $250,000 into that education. There's just no world in which that really makes financial sense. Now, there may be other reasons to go to an elite university, and he's a part of a fraternity, shout out ATO. And I am confident that the connections that he's making there will serve him well for the rest of his life. He's running in a circle of guys that are well connected and really astute and sharp guys that are, highly sociable, highly skilled, highly intelligent. They're just good group of guys, and he gets to spend a lot of time, gets to know them, and it's great. Having said that, we recently started homeschooling our 4th kid. She's a sophomore. And in Ohio, just to show you how the waters are changing on this, the requirements I'm going to read you the complete requirements to homeschool in the state of Ohio. Parents agree to provide instruction in English language arts, mathematics, science, history, government, and social studies, and notify the superintendent each year. That's it. You can teach your kids those subjects at whatever level you deem appropriate and fill out a 1-page form and submit it to the superintendent each year. That's the totality of the requirement to homeschool. So in addition to that, you can actually get free community college tuition and take community college classes along with your homeschool classes if you'd like to get some college credits. Now, this kid isn't going to college. She's really smart, but she's not interested in college, and I have no interest in sending her. So point being, the game is changing. I don't think that high school even is essential at this point. I think that most of the educational system, while there are pockets of goodness and beauty and some schooling models that are very interesting and inspiring. Montessori is interesting. There's another one that I can't think of the name right now, but it's kind of set up the same way. But the traditional educational model where you line kids up in rows and you make them raise their hand to be able to talk and ask permission to go to the bathroom, live bell to bell, all that stuff, that is just a model that no longer serves us. It was implemented, inspired by, I think, the Prussian system in the late 19th century, kind of a militaristic model, the goal being to produce obedient factory workers to fill the growing need for factory workers. And we don't have that economy anymore. We don't have that need. Our kids don't need to be taught to sit down and shut up and ask permission. They need to be taught to engage with reality at the deepest level that they can manage and to map their whole being onto that reality to the greatest degree that they can manage, to adapt to new realities as fast as they can, and to be able to hold two things in tension at once and to have a sophisticated mindset. That none of that really happens in the traditional educational model, even in college, right? So now, there's some good stuff that happens in some universities. I'm pretty pleased with the education that Ben's getting at Vanderbilt. The dean there considers himself a free speech absolutist, so he makes there's no safe spaces and, microaggressions being counted there. So that's good. But I think that there is, obviously some of the elite universities are extremely fragile from that perspective and have long, to your point, come out of alignment with providing the value to the student that they charge in tuition. So across a long enough timeline, anything that is not suited to the market by providing services that are in relationship to what they cost or charge, across a long enough timeline, that's going to fail. Everything has to get aligned to reality at some point. So if you're overcharging for an elite education that really only teaches you to be a fragile activist, you probably won't, over the long run, be able to charge $100,000 a year to do that because it doesn't produce that kind of value. So I think that we're teaching our kids that it is a case-by-case situation, and I am totally confident in our ability to prepare them for reality to a much greater degree than they could get sitting in 98% of K through 12 schools and a good many universities as well. So I am not a big fan of the traditional education model, and I make no apologies for it. I have met some teachers that are wonderfully skilled and are really living sacrificially to offer the best that they can to their students. And I take nothing away from them when I say the model is not well suited to today's reality.
Austin, what are your thoughts?
Two things. The first is that, when you said high school, like not necessarily, I'm like, okay, well, let me think back. What lasting value did I get from high school that I actually use today? Like social skills and sports aside, what did I actually learn in high school that is helping me in my career today? And it's interesting because my brother and I were talking about this just recently, and I would say it's English communication. The school that I went to was a self-paced curriculum, Kent, not a fantastic education, but the one thing that they were known for was their grammar, spelling, sentence structure, things like that. And understand, I'm coming through the lens of somebody who's in communication. Like I'm in real estate. I talk for a living. I email for a living. I write contracts for a living. I negotiate for a living. I talk. That's what I do. So sometimes my first impression of someone is an email that comes through. If they missed a punctuation or they say something weird, I'm sorry, I judge them. Like, I know I shouldn't, and I'm not like kicking the can down the road, but there is something to that first impression, or when I meet someone and I don't assume that they have $1 million or $10 million or $5 based on how they talk, but there is something to be said to that's the one thing. And I think so I didn't go to college. I did 6 years of landscape construction before I did real estate. And I took one college course for landscape design. That's the extent of my furthering education. I have a high school diploma. In those, I don't know, what am I, 36 now, and graduated when I was 18, started working right after that. I can only remember one instance where I actually used algebra in my whole career. And I run a business, do accounting. And I remember going to my brother in his upstairs office and asking him, I'm stuck here. I know this is algebra, but it's been so long since I've done it and I need it for this thing. That's it. So again, very limited, worldview or whatever you want to call it. But that's the one thing, the one value that high school brought to me is communication in English. And I naturally like to read and to learn. And, Patrick, I would have never guessed that you have your GED and that's it. I mean, you're very well spoken. You obviously have a passion for vocabulary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's not something that and that's what I think of, if you care about something, you invest into it, you read, you better yourself, whatever it is. And so there is this whole thing of self-teaching yourself things that there's value to that is outside of school instead of just doing the tests and passing the grades. I mean, I passed. Did I learn anything? I passed biology. I don't remember a lick of it. I mean, not really, hardly anything. I took algebra and algebra 2, somehow snuck my way through it. And I wasn't a great student. I'm not a brain learner. I don't read something and then understand it. I understand it when I do it. Mm-hmm. And I'm a hands-on guy. And so I agree with you guys that this cookie cutter way of education that we're putting on everyone I didn't realize where it came from. That was interesting, Patrick. Thanks for sharing that. I think it is outdated. What value does it provide? I mean, it seems like less and less, but I'm in a different stage. I have 2 girls, a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. And I started, just thinking from the sheer concept of where's my mindset for them in the future? Well, I opened up an investment account for them. It's mine, but it's tagged, girl's future. And I'm putting money into it. The last thing I'm expecting it to go towards is college. I'm just not. If they decide, if I see that there's a gifting and a calling there and sending them to school is a thing to do, great. And I'm a planner, but I'm not planning to pay for my kids' college. And judge me if you want, but I was listening to the Ramsey show. I forget what percentage of people are that actually use their degree, for what they went to school for. It was pretty low. So I'm not where you guys are at in terms of Kent, you've got kids coming into high school. Patrick, you've got them in high school and college. They're hardly even going to school right now. But I am interested in education because I do want my girls to learn how to read, be well-spoken. So what we're doing and works really well is we read to them a lot. And that's just because that's a value that we have. And my kids are very well-spoken. I mean, Elsie's not quite speaking yet, but Summer, just from us reading and her listening to her stories, her vocabulary is amazing. And she's got good grammar and pronunciation. So that's just a value for me. Knowing how far that's brought me. And if I have a kid that is good at math and wants to be an engineer, well, then, I'm going to have to send him somewhere that knows that stuff. And I don't know how that looks like yet. So that decision's down the road for us, what they're going to do for high school even. And we are taking it kid by kid, even what we're going to do with them education. So those are my 2 cents on it.
Austin, what was the second thing you mentioned about high school? The first was, grammar and English. What was the second thing?
Spelling. I mean, the whole thing. A sentence structure. Like, I still, like, in the industry that I'm in, I don't really care what someone did before they did real estate. Just, are you good at it? Can you communicate? Can you do your freaking job? I don't care what you did. I don't care what your degree is in. I don't care what it is. And I don't even know some of the best ones, like, they probably don't have much of a degree, if any. And I just see it, even texting, like, dude, why are you doing double spacing and then put an exclamation point? Like, do you not know that it's a period, then 2 spaces, then you start your sentence? Don't you know that this is where you break the paragraph up? That's too long of a sentence. Break that apart. This is what a semicolon does. Things like basic communication.
Hey, by the way, did you know you're not supposed to do 2 spaces after a period anymore? I honestly,
really?
I did not. This might be embarrassing. I did not know that.
iPhone has led us wrong then.
Until the last
That's
year.
That's a relatively new update to the to the tradition. So
yeah, and I don't know how they send these updates out, but I totally missed it. I was doing period 2 spaces, and then I was around some academics, and I don't even remember how this came up, but like, no, actually, that's not how you're supposed to do it anymore. It was news to me. But what's interesting about what you just said, Austin, are you saying that the curriculum that we grew up on in school was strong in English? Because I had not heard that before. I did not know it.
Yeah.
That's very fascinating to me because
it is.
I would only compare my, I don't know what to compare to. I guess like you're saying, the people that you email, I guess I feel like my grammar is at least average, if not maybe a little bit better than average. And I've always been fascinated by words, putting the words together just right in a sentence. I love that shit. So now I'm kind of curious if maybe that had more to do with the exact curriculum we were using in school than I was aware of.
It did. And the reason I know that is because I still remember how to break apart sentences. Like, remember, you put the line under this, 2 lines under the verb, and just the whole breakdown of learning how to dissect a sentence. You don't understand something until you understand how it's supposed to be structured. Prepositions are not something that I end sentences with. Patrick got it.
Nicely done.
Like, just knowing things like that, just basic rules. I'm not even talking about spelling. I'm talking about an email. I'm like, why did you say it like that? And
yeah, I totally agree. I think that is a huge value. And what's interesting is, and I don't know how this happened, I don't know exactly. Lincoln's been to 3 different schools. Can you believe that he is in 9th grade and he has not been taught typing yet?
Bro,
typing? I thought they learned that in like 1st grade now.
Well, look, it might be reflection on the exact schools he's gone to, because he's been at 2 or 3 different schools now. And I don't know when he was supposed to learn this, but I do know for a fact that when he was very young, one of the schools, their thought process was by the time they graduate, they're going to be using iPads only. Wrong. So Lincoln's going to do a typing course this winter, because the skill that I use the most on a daily basis, aside from knowing how to think, is typing and crafting messages and communication. Highly, highly, highly important. And the other thing two things that I think I forgot to mention is I do see the value in a network in colleges, and this is 100%. What you see, huge value, and this is what you see these tech founders, the founders of you name the tech company. This is what 9 out of 10 of them do: is they get into an elite school and they're there for a year or 2 at the most, and that proves the world that they can do it. They develop their network, and guess what they do? They get out. And so that's what the billionaires are doing. And so there is a value in the network there, and there can be a value in certain circles and certain industries on showing that you got into a great school, but they don't stay around for the whole thing. So I do see the value in the network, but I also think you can get that. I also think you can get a little bit more of that in high school now, to be honest, the way that schools are run. I mean, they run some of these high schools like colleges now. But then the other thing that I didn't mention, which is just so obvious, it might not need to mention, but it's technology. It's technology and AI. And you know what? You don't actually have to know the capital of Texas anymore in your head. You can find it out like that. So the greater value now is on knowing how to think, reasoning, knowing how to manipulate the information that's already available to you. And guess what? That can't be taught.
No, well, it can be modeled maybe, but
Yeah.
talking about that line of thinking, it's also in using AI. You can use AI so much more powerfully if you know how to describe what it is you want and need from it, right? So as I'm learning this, I'm noticing that some of my prompts are, 300 to 500 words long, right? And I save them and reuse them for various things because I'm describing more precisely what I'm looking for out of ChatGPT. And so I encourage my kids more than anything in this area to learn to read and write. It's like you can use your iPhone to do math. It's like you only need to be moderately good at math, but you need to be wicked good at reading and writing and speaking. And if you do that, like my sophomore who's homeschooling, I mean, her book list for this year is prodigious. It's long and heavy, and it's real books. It's Dostoevsky, it's Aldous Huxley, George Orwell. We'll probably get some Jordan Peterson in there. It's a well-rounded and deep library of books that she's reading, classics. Just helping her map reality and helping her find her place in it and knowing how to speak, think, write. And even, my son who's at Vanderbilt, one of the things I keep reminding him of is learning how to read, write, and speak is as critical as anything he's going to do there. And to your point, he is building a great network of connections. His friends, parents, and grandparents own major league sports teams and stuff like that. So, that'll probably serve him well in terms of his network. But what he's learning there, I'm sure it's helpful, but his own emphasis on making sure that he's deadly good at reading and writing and speaking is going to make a big difference for him.
Yeah. So communication, highly important. Reading, writing, speaking, all these things, highly important. Network, important. Being socially adapted in this world, knowing how to function as a person in society, highly important. And then wherever you can, and knowing how to manipulate the information that's readily available to you, important. So, in the cases where school is the best method of going about all that, fantastic. In the cases where it might not be the best method, then hey, maybe there's other ways also, all right, that was fun. You guys ready to move on? We having fun? We feeling good? I got some more stuff on the docket here.
Let's go. Hit it, man.
Politics and church. Politics and church. How about that? Should we jump into it?
Oh, might as well. Sounds spicy.
Jump into it. So I'm going to kick it to you guys first. Politics and church, should they always remain separate? Should church leaders ever leverage themselves, or should churches ever leverage themselves or their leaders to propagate what they believe to be positive change in the world? Does too much political involvement create unnecessary stumbling blocks at the spiritual level? Are there conditions that could exist that would place a responsibility on church leaders to express political opinions? What do you guys think? I don't think I'm going to ask you a specific question, but what do you guys think about this topic of church and politics? At one level, of course, everyone who is going to church is probably aware of politics to some degree. It is going to have an effect on their life and the lives of those around them to some degree. In some cases, more than people might think. In some cases, probably way, way less than some people might think. And these are the people that are going to church. And churches want to do good in this world. They want to make the world a better place. They want to, I guess, ultimately, the ones that are Christian, they want to help people grow spiritually. So is there any place where it is appropriate to sort of, go from one world into the other, if we even want to think about them in two separate worlds? Or is it just more often than not, is it damaging, and should they remain separate? Patrick, I'm going to kick it over to you, and then Austin.
It's a hard thing to know. I mean, I'm still processing this. So just as I talk this out, just know that it's coming from a place of kind of processing and trying to figure this out myself. So I haven't arrived anywhere solid here. But what I've been thinking about relative to this is the church, our mission in the church is to grow people in their embodiment of Christ, and to help them flourish as a human being as a result of that, living as Christ in community, in the world, and all of that, and bringing forward a greater sense of humanity, greater sense of godliness, greater glory to God, all of that. And I could understand the argument for there being certainly a voice advocating for a more human, a more godly society, and setting things up in a way to maximally provide a level playing field for people to flourish and to provide basic protections in which humanity can flourish. So I see, there's a role for a voice to emerge from that. But the way that it's happened in the past that makes me skeptical about all of that is the way that the kind of Western Christianity, let's say, has kind of merged with the political level of culture over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And that has weakened the church's influence significantly. The Western church, evangelical Christianity in particular, really aligned themselves with the moral majority and the Christian conservative movement back in the 80s and 90s. And that ended up being, that didn't do anything good for the church. I don't know that it did much good for politics either, but it was that, if it's going to be like it was there, that's a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. But when I think back across history and I think about, Bonhoeffer, I think about pastors who could have advocated for, spoken up against what they saw happening in the 1930s in Germany. I certainly think that pastors should be speaking up for human dignity and the advance of the flourishing of humanity, and to speak out against things that corrupt that. But maybe not entirely from a political angle, maybe more from the angle of helping people to map themselves onto reality more accurately, and to be able to live more with more wisdom as a result of that. And then, of course, what stems from that is an objection to tyranny. Because there is a deep way in which tyranny, if you think about the kind of fundamentals of human life, you think about tyranny and freedom. People move from tyranny to freedom and back again. And the kingdom of heaven continues to grow and flourish when, no matter whether people are in tyranny or in freedom, there's a spirit that stays alive and that can grow no matter what's happening kind of up here at this level of tyranny, political tyranny. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak out against tyranny. I think that if we love God and we love each other, of course, we'll speak out to end tyranny and to take it apart, to destroy it, to see it no longer exercise its power. Let my people go so that they can go worship in the wilderness, to echo Moses, right? So it's not just a deliverance from tyranny, but it's a deliverance from tyranny into a more purposeful life, into something that's organized around the highest good. And I think if pastors are doing that, great. But I think it takes both of those things. It's let my people go, and so that they might worship God in the wilderness, and so that they can organize their lives around a higher uniting principle.
Austin, what do you think?
My mind, sorry, I'm still swirling. I was hoping Patrick would talk a little longer so I could collect my thoughts.
Something nobody's ever said before.
I'm just going to, vocalize here. So Romans 13 talks about, it's a great chapter on the government. So as you were talking, Patrick, and I was listening, but I was curious what it said because that came to mind, and you read that chapter, and it's almost like it says they are God's servants, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. So you must submit to them not only to avoid punishment, but also to keep a clear conscience. So it's like the government serves a purpose. I just think what's happened is the church, by and large, isn't doing their job, so the government steps in. Like I think there's a lot of mental health issues that are actually spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, the whole buzz on mental health and that kind of a thing, I mean, there's studies out there, people that pray for, a reasonable amount of time per day or in the Word, they actually don't have mental health issues. And I want to be careful to make blanket statements because there are actual mind sicknesses that are out there. But think of, where culture is at right now with this whole, just the issue of mental health and medication. Like the amount of demons that are medicated, I really would like to know. I'd like to know how much of this is because we're not doing our job. So I think as a result, then you have a government and everybody, if you don't look to God, you look to the government. Am I right? Or you look to something else. You look to some other higher power or someone else to fix the problem. And so then we've got an over-involved government doing the church's job. Government has a job. It does. If you look at Scripture, it's very clear. There's a purpose for government, but then there's a purpose for the church. And I just think that, by and large, we haven't been stepping up to the plate and confronting these issues and pressing in and asking the Lord for authority over these things. I think, Patrick, what you're doing is great. It's wonderful. I mean, you're literally like going to save marriages with what you do. You're going to help you're going to help men with their mental oppression, not by a pill, but by a process. And the pill is easy. And so that's my first thought. Second thought is I was involved in government for almost 5 years. I was, invited to be a part of a local planning board. And guys, it's not for me. It's, I'm a part of our church's leadership team. And that was my only experience with an organization, other than being raised in the Mennonite church, which I was too young to remember any of that, how that was really run, or not be involved in the day-to-day. And our church's leadership team would just run so differently than, being in that local government. And I just felt this, this constant, who's the man behind the controls when I was in government, and almost like I was just checking boxes and rubber stamping things. And like, I don't want to knock what government does, but it wasn't a pleasant experience for me. So it's not for me. I did it for a while, and then I resigned early because I couldn't do it. Politics is not my game. That being said, I don't think it's right that people have an opinion about, the next president or governor or whomever, and don't go out there and do something about it. I mean, at the very least, you can vote. So stop whining without a solution. Like, do what you can in this thing and don't complain. Like, at least go out there and vote, and then I think you're free to have an opinion. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah.
What do you think, Kent?
Well, I think a couple things. I think one of it is that I think most of us are far deeper inside a particular worldview than we realize. And I've been thinking a lot about this in the last probably year. And so I think a healthy distrust of one's own opinions, I think, is good. And what I mean by that is, how easy it is to sort of, and Twitter's a great example of this. Like, you maybe listened to a certain podcast or got into a certain kind of frame of mind or got around a certain bit of information, and then you would like tweet something that someone's going to read that, and they have zero of that context, zero of that background, and they have no idea. Like, it doesn't, they have no idea where you're coming from. And that may be like just a very tactical example of how steeped in our own worldview you can get. And here's another example I can give you. in probably 2020, probably 2020 into 2021 was, I can just come out and say it, was probably the farthest left that I've ever been in my life. And I actually feel like I gave it a good run. Like, with some of that stuff that was happening, look, I mean, I just tend to sort of be like anti-authoritarian, right? And so, you get Trump in there for 4 years. I'm not paying attention. I've never been really that involved politically. My dad, paid a little bit more attention. My grandpa, my dad's dad, paid more attention. They would keep up with like world events and talk about it, and you would hear about some of the stuff at family gatherings. I just never paid that much attention. I'm trying to grow a business. I'm trying to run the family. You know what I mean? Like, I just wasn't that involved. And then, and then COVID happened, and so I guess in the run up to that is, heck, I have podcasts about, me being pretty anti what was going on with Trump. And so I was steeped in a particular worldview over those couple of years, probably a lot more than I realized. And what I want to take care of now is that I don't become too steeped in a particular worldview that might be on the other side, the more right side, that's missing some objective truths that remain out there that I might be missing them, based on my algorithm, based on the people I'm paying attention to, these types of things. My general point on this front is that, and this could be something we could just talk about for 20 minutes and we won't, but I just think that everyone, at least in America, at least most people that are paying half attention to anything that's going on, tend to be nestled far deeper in their particular worldview than they realize. And the reason I say that is because I think that should temper our public opinions. And I think we should make sure that we only say things that we actually believe, and we don't get too caught up in narrative and talking points. Because I see it now in Nashville. There are Christians very outspoken that are more on the right, and there are Christians outspoken that are more on the left. And each one is probably more right than they might, or more accurate, more correct in some of their thinking than they might realize, and probably more wrong in their thinking than they might realize. And so I just think that's thing one. And then I think on thing two, it would be way easier if you could pick the 4 issues you like out of the one candidate and the 6 issues you like out of the other candidate, and create an avatar combining those two. And I kind of feel like if you could do that, then maybe the church maybe could potentially, I don't want to say should, but maybe could potentially be a little bit more vocal, but you can't, and you never will be able to. And so if you're going to support a particular candidate, you just aren't going to be able to communicate properly all of the reasons why, and people are going to misinterpret, because it doesn't really matter which candidate you pick. There's going to be a whole lot of negatives that go along with that. And, so it's going to have to come down to what you value most and which candidate is going to be the best for the things that you value the most, So I just think that's kind of thought number 2 is there's just going to be pros and cons with whoever you pick. And so that should probably temper. But then the third, and this is the biggest thought, is the law of the category. And this just is the way it is. But the law of the category, anyone who's in marketing or particularly in branding, they already know this. But the law of the category, you get one area, you get one category with which to be influential. Mm-hmm. If you've chosen for that category for you to be spiritual, to be spiritually influential, to, if your category is to be spiritually influential, when you step outside of that and try to be politically influential, you are undermining your ability to be spiritually influential. And that just is the way it is. There's a reason that brands are focused on one thing, and then you can sometimes bring in some other things that are somewhat related, a lot of times actually very closely related, and that works. But if you're going to do something completely different, that should probably be its own brand. That just somehow is the way it is. And in my opinion, if your profession or your career or your life calling is to be spiritually influential, there is no higher calling. I'm not saying it's necessarily, well, in some ways it is higher than other callings, but I'm not saying that person necessarily like it's better to be a pastor than a bricklayer, because I think there's honor and dignity in no matter what you do. But the one thing I will say is there's not necessarily a higher calling, than being spiritually influential. I mean, ultimately, these are things that deal with like the most ultimate things in life, the things that actually matter the most. And so if that is your calling, I do think you can undermine that influence if you're dipping into politics too much. And quite frankly, I think we saw a little bit of this in COVID. A little bit of this in COVID, because what I had not known until recently was that Fauci's boss is a guy named Francis Collins. And Francis Collins, I don't know him very well. I don't know that much about him. I've seen his picture. I don't even know if I'd recognize him if I saw him at an airport. But from what I understand of Francis Collins, and I don't understand that much, but from what I understand, he's an older, very well educated, very smart, probably very kind, and probably very godly man. And, what I didn't really know was that there was sort of a strategy at play during COVID and the vaccines in particular, where the plan was for Fauci to go to the news media and influence them, and Francis Collins to go to the evangelical church leaders and influence them. And the thinking was that if we can use our churches and our church leaders to influence people to get the vaccine, that this is going to do good in the world, and it is going to bring about more of the things that we would all want to see: health, prosperity, etc. Well, that was mostly wrong, and it didn't turn out. I think it was probably well intended, but what happened, and I think is unfortunate, is there was a few people that I respect and were and are influenced by spiritually, and will continue to be so, and have no problem with that. But one of the strategies, this was in writing, one of the ideas that was given to some of these church leaders was, the one thing you can do is when you do get the vaccine, you can post it on social media, and you can talk about how you can make sure people know that you got it, and encourage others to do the same. And look, that may be the right answer for some people, but it was not the right answer for everyone. And some people died from it. I bought a motorcycle because someone died 2 weeks after the vaccine at age 60 with no prior health conditions. That's not coincidence, in my opinion. In my opinion. And so just to tie a bow on that is, now I think a little bit differently, about some of those people that were exerting influence in a particular direction. And I chalk it up to naivety. I chalk it up to good intentions. But I do think that you can lose influence as a spiritual leader, probably quicker than you might think, if you're dipping into the political realm too quickly.
Yeah, I mean, politics are important because they do create the conditions in which people either flourish or don't. And if you get in your car and you drive through the Midwest, you drive through the average town of 2,000 to 20,000 people, maybe 100,000 people. there is just town after town after town that you will go through that the downtowns are dead and quiet or dying. And the churches that are still open, most of them have their services in some god-awful pole barn looking building of some kind. The beautiful old churches in town barely have enough people left on the membership rosters to pay the bills, and most of those bills are getting paid by the national organization that has gone so far to the left that they're not able to be differentiated from some government NGO that really just talks a good game but doesn't do a whole lot. And as a result, in a lot of the organizations, structures, and kind of, the community aspects that used to give people a reason to come together and build community, a lot of those have become less influential in life. And a lot of our small towns in the Midwest have become these kind of post-industrial, fentanyl-laced hellscapes that are mostly, billboards and fast food joints and strip malls. And the ugliness of it just sucks the life right out of your soul. Like, it's brutal. And that's politics. But it's also the church. The church has not advocated for or understood its role in bringing forth things like beauty and the role that beauty plays in human flourishing. They haven't advocated for the arts. They haven't advocated for some of these things that give life its texture and its richness. And particularly the evangelical church in the West has reduced a lot of its religious thinking to kind of a pretty thin layer of dogma and sin management. And I know that's a sweeping critique, and I maybe don't mean it as harshly as it sounds, but I think both the political apparatus and the religious structure, we can lay the blame for the denigration of our communities at the feet of both of these, maybe in equal measure. And I'm not sure where to go from there other than the conservative message that we have to get back to a time when things were good. That doesn't work. And that's a tricky thing because there's nowhere to go back to. The world has fundamentally changed. There is no going back to the way things were in, let's say, the 50s, right? When, maybe the American family was stronger and the good old days, so to speak, that people kind of long for. And the conservative message is insufficient in that way, in that there is no going back to that. We have AI, we have the technological revolution, we have the information revolution. Everything's changed. The world's a different place, and there is no going back to that. What we have to do is the hard work of creating a structure in which we can go forward into that moves us into greater human flourishing, a structure that promotes the family as the minimum viable unit for relationships. One of the things that's happening in the culture is the denigration of the family. So, you see the declining birth rate, you see the growing number of single young men. 1 in 3 young men under 30 has not had sex in the last year, and 1 in 3 young men under 30, 1 in 2 young men under 30 are not in a serious relationship or pursuing one or interested in one. 1 in 2, right? And there's a big overlap between that group and the group that is going to be living in those tiny homes that you mentioned earlier in their parents' backyard. But those problems...
You're so right. You're so right.
I mean, it's just true,
man.
right?
That's so bad.
It's terrible. And it's easy to kind of poke fun at these guys and say, like, hey, you need to get out of your mother's basement and stop eating cheese curls and watching porn. There's a life to be lived out there. But I think that the church and the political apparatus has failed to deliver a message to parents to adequately shape their children and adequately prepare them for the world that they're entering into. And the political apparatus has failed to create the kind of communities or create the conditions in which communities can flourish. Just think about little things around COVID, for example. There's a big move to, both on the right and the left, to be clear, to tattle on each other. to, if you see something, say something, turning your neighbor against your neighbor. And when cultures fall apart and truly go to hell, if you want to study 1920s Russia, 1930s Germany, situations where things truly spiraled into hell, one of the defining characteristics of those societies was that people snitched on each other. There was a culture of snitching and a culture of lying. Everybody, people, you don't get a Stalin or a Hitler unless people agree to lie. Almost everybody agrees to lie about almost everything. It doesn't happen otherwise. And that's why they're trying to shut down free speech. And by trying to shut down free speech, I'm talking about an animating spirit that motivates those who would seek to rule over and subjugate their fellow human. The animating spirit, one of those things is a spirit of mistrust, a spirit of snitching, and a spirit of lying. And I think we have to build a future that's not returning to some hypothetical past where everything was okay, where maybe the church had more political influence or politics maybe weren't as far left. I think we have to ask ourselves the hard questions and do the hard work of starting with ourselves and from the inside out rebuild America, starting with me, starting with my heart, my life. I have a vision for my life where my mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional health is flourishing. And that's true of my wife and children today and into the future. And that's what I'm going to work towards to the best of my ability. That takes a radical commitment to the truth. It takes humility. It takes curiosity. It takes a spirit of play and adventure. And it takes courage. And it calls forward the best in you to seek to build that. If you think about the path forward from here that is maximally loving, and that's what love is. Love is to work for the good of the other, let's say, and that other includes some future version of you next week, just to be clear. But if you lay out a path that's maximally beneficial for you and your family and everybody else around you, both today and every day into the future, that's an impossibly narrow path. That's a really difficult needle to thread. The only path that I know of that leads to that is the path of Christ. That's the narrow way. That's the impossibly narrow way of the kingdom. And that is the pattern for maximum human flourishing. That's what I think the Sermon on the Mount is about. I read the Sermon on the Mount as a meditation on the nature of reality and a teaching on how to flourish in it. And I think when Jesus said things like, the meek shall inherit the earth, I think he was describing a factual reality. And if you look at the birth rate, for example, it's not hard to understand how that's true. Who is it that's going to actually inherit the earth? It's people whose lives adhere to a certain set of patterns that you might describe as meek. And the people who are at below replacement rate at a population level are patterning their life after other priorities. And I don't have to judge it any further than that to point out that the Sermon on the Mount is, to the extent that we don't understand how it maps onto reality, is just a result of our blindness. It's not, there you have the creator of all things describing the nature of reality to you, to each of us. And if we can build a future that aligns with the truth of the Sermon on the Mount, then we can build a shining city on a hill. Then we can build the future in which the kingdom of heaven continues to grow and manifest and change lives. I think, we're moving towards a future at some point. Talking about all of this reminds me of apocalypse. It reminds me of, what's coming. And what's coming is, at some point in the future, every knee will bow. Every knee, every being will be drawn into the magnetism of love that is God. And that draw is so powerful that at some point it will unite everybody around that love. Now, what we have to create in the meantime, we have to navigate our way forward through politics, through church, through family, through doing the hard work of becoming, to create that future. We are the hands and feet of Christ here on this earth, bringing forward the restoration of Eden, the restoration of the good, the restoration of all things, putting them in right relationship with each other. We embody his love in the world. So we can't just ignore politics, because politics are a key part of that. But the political apparatus that exists today is so corrupt that I don't know that there's a way to reform it. It may need to be replaced by something else, but that's super scary, because the experiment that we've had here in America has been the best experiment to date. And when you remove it, you have a vacuum, and what rushes into that vacuum is often something like tyranny and not, the kingdom of heaven. So that's where I'm stuck. I'm not exactly sure how to update the current system without opening the door to darker energies in the meantime.
Let's go from there into thoughts on some of the headwinds facing mature manhood today. Patrick, I actually want to kick it back to you on this. So what do you see as some of the challenges for young males, young men, in facing them in their role as a man, to be a mature man, to properly embody the manhood that we were meant to? What are some of the headwinds that you see out there right now? And then Austin after Patrick.
Well, when I think about the guy that's coming up through the system, the educational system, and entering the workforce, he's in his 20s or 30s. He's been taught his whole life that most of his true and good masculine instincts are to not be trusted, right? His desire to compete, his desire to be competent and to build skills, that's all been shaded as a lust for power and a desire to rule over, and it's been denigrated, and it's been beaten out of him before he's in 12th grade. And if he makes it through college, he won't have any shred, typically, of that desire to bring forward the competent and strong, gifted man that he could be. It's just culturally not accepted. He's been told that that's nothing other than a lust for power. So that's one headwind. And then you have, the manufacturing has been offshored. So most of the jobs that pay good money aren't here anymore. So they, again, those are the guys that are living in these tiny homes he talked about. Because money comes from creating value. And if most of the value creating jobs have been offshored, where are you going to generate the value to make the money? So there's a couple headwinds. And then you get out into a world where the uniting story that has animated us for so long has, we've just pulled the rug out from the culture in the kind of post-scientific, post-enlightenment world that we live in now. The animating story about God and our relationship to him has been killed. I think Nietzsche was right when he said that, culturally speaking, God is dead. And he wasn't crowing about that fact. He was lamenting the fact that we've lost our story. We've lost the uniting story that our culture was built on. And he accurately predicted that would lead to tens of millions of deaths in the 20th century, because in the death of that God vision, that you would enter in, an Übermensch or a strongman mentality. And that's what happened with Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and others. So there has been a shift and a change in the way that we understand the story. That collapse of the story about God has led to just anxiety, because anxiety is basically not knowing how to differentiate what's important, how to differentiate signal from noise. And so we don't have the story to understand reality in anymore. And, the kind of scientific story started falling apart with the advent of things like quantum theory. And now quantum theory is not even sufficient to explain what we now understand about reality. So all of a sudden, the limits of science have been reached. That fall has been accelerated by things like the COVID vaccine debacle, because you saw people, trust in science, and then all of a sudden they noticed that science had been corrupted by something else. So there's a lot of our narratives are collapsing. And so you have a young man entering into a world that he's not well suited for. He doesn't have a place to step into. Young men flourish and thrive when they adopt responsibility, the responsibility of getting married young and having offspring. There's nothing better for a young man to pour himself into than that. But to your point, you can't do that if you're stuck in your mom's basement wearing your Walmart basketball shorts and eating cheese curls and playing video games. You're not attractive to mates, and you're not going to find and then the added problem of, women tend to marry across and up social hierarchies. So colleges have become incredibly oriented towards women. There's way more women in college than men. So you have way more 4-year degrees going to women than you do men. And those 4-year degree women get out of college and they're just picking the very best from the dating pool, and everybody else is left to be in the basement or in the backyard. And those guys, the only way that you keep that from being a revolution in 10 years is by just keeping that crowd medicated with porn and weed and, anything else you can throw down the basement stairs. So it's just brutal. The environment is really tough. But I will say, on the bright side, at the Good King community, I'm seeing the message that I share with men in the Good King is that there is a way forward. There is a pattern for your life. That pattern is Christ. And let's build a community where we walk together and fashion our lives after that model. And by doing so, we fashion our lives onto the true map of reality. I was thinking about that verse, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. That is something like not a factual set of truths, but the ancient language there really reveals it's more like you will be mapped onto reality in a more true way. And that will liberate you. Not a freedom to pursue hedonic pleasures impulsively, but it will liberate you from the things that you are bound by. And that's what we're finding as we walk together in the Good King, is that liberation that comes from knowing the truth. And this isn't a kind of knowing where we know it in our heads intellectually. It's an experiential knowing. So we experientially know reality in a more deep way, and that liberates us to build the life that we were created for. So you see, I think, a growing bifurcation, a split between the haves and the have-nots. And Jesus talked about that idea too, where something like those who have, to those who have more will be given, to those who don't have, things will be taken away. I butchered that quote, but that's the essence of it. And I kind of see that growing split emerge in the culture, where you have an increasingly small pool of men who are competent and have the income and the kind of genetic makeup and all of that to have their pick in the dating pool, and then 90% of the guys are left fighting for the scraps, and most of them have just checked out.
Austin, what do you think? What are some of the headwinds you see facing proper manhood today?
Yeah, well, Proverbs says, where there is no vision, people perish.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, what's forefront of my mind is we have a way of taking scripture and not making it practical. And so I love the Bible because it's for real. It's for today. And, I always, when you ask these questions, I tend to speak from my own experience, and I look back in my life, okay, well, when I was struggling with like the issues of manhood and who am I and who am I called to be, not what am I called to do, it really came down to that whole thing of like seeing. Vision is something you can see. And so I find myself constantly, like when I'm, I've been doing real estate now for 10 years, and I'm like, well, anybody can do this. I mean, like there's so many of them out there. It's a flooded market. What's my purpose? Then that's what that's when my true north is gone, when I don't have a vision. If I can't see what I saw, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like I need a new vision every time. It's just sometimes I need to see what I saw. And for me, that's what the challenge for me is personally, is when I lose sight of what I'm called to do and who I'm not just what I'm called to do, but who I'm called to be. And yeah, I think what Patrick was saying too is that whole thing of people have checked out, and the problem is that society is trying to craft a nice box for men. They want men to be women. We're not called to be. It's kind of like the whole feminist movement. There's a part of that I was actually all about. I think women have it. They're half of who God is. We don't want a glass ceiling for them. We don't want to, suppress them or anything like that. But every a reaction to something that's right, wrong, or indifferent creates a worst action on the other end. In other words, like, just because maybe women were suppressed in the past doesn't mean that we go far the other extreme and suppress men now. That doesn't win anything. And but yeah, I think if I were to simplify it in the whole, lack of vision, when I'm lacking vision, temptation to be lackadaisical, porn, medicate in any way, shape, or form really slips in. But when I'm gunning for something, like, I just like watching you, Patrick, because you're a man with a vision. You've seen something. I can see that you're seeing something, and that you're going for it. And it's like you're running the race that is set before you, but you actually have a race that you're running. I think that's the guy you're talking about living in his parents' basement. He doesn't have a race to run.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't know what he's called to. He doesn't know even who he's called to be. And so I think for me, that's the common denominator in my experience when I step out of manhood, or even who I'm called to be as a leader in the home. When I, just set that aside or just find myself not caring, it's because I'm not seeing what I need to see. So
Yeah.
that's my thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it, guys. Yeah, my first thought was, okay, well, what is manhood? Like, what is masculinity? And the three things that come to mind, which Patrick may have talked about this briefly, but I engineered my way into these three words based on going to a Jordan Peterson event, because I could not figure out the room. It was very different. And then I settled on, okay, the common denominator I see in most everyone here is they look like good protectors, good providers, and good lovers. And I know that sounds kind of weird. It's just that seemed to be the common denominator in the room. And then I was thinking later, well, actually, that's sort of masculinity in a nutshell. It might be more than that, but it's not less than that. You got to protect, you got to provide, and you got to love. That's the job. And there's probably more, but again, there's not less. And so I see anything against those three things as a headwind to proper manhood. And the biggest one that I see is just the current cultural narratives. Guys are being told how to be a man from women, which is probably the first indication that something's not totally right. And there seems to be a lot of political motivation behind what these women are saying. And I am not saying that women cannot help a man become a man, or offer some advice or some ideas along the way that could be helpful. But manhood tends to be passed from men onto boys that become men. It just seems like that's part of the design. So there does seem to be the current cultural narratives, in my opinion, is the biggest headwind. Let's wrap this up. We're out of time. This was fun. Thank you guys very much. This was episode 2 of Metal and Forge. Go to mettleandforge.com. Pop in a question, do it anonymously, or leave your name. We don't care. We're happy to know who you are, but if you feel better making it anonymous, that's fine too. drop in a topic suggestion, drop in a question. We might get to it on the podcast. We would love that. Austin, anything you want to plug? And then Patrick?
Good.
Nope. Patrick?
Yeah, I'd love if you'd connect with me on Instagram, goodking.life, or check out my website, goodking.life.
Love it. And I'm pretty active over on X these days, not so much on Twitter, and haven't been on Facebook for a long, long time. But I'm actually very active on X. I'm just at Kent Lapp on X. Would love to. I would love for you to follow me on X. But no, seriously, that would be fun to connect over there. And I'm looking for some help in operations with Amish Co. So if you're good with people, good communicator, good problem solver, and get satisfaction and fulfillment in logistics, checking boxes, getting jobs done, I could use some help over there. I think that will do it. So thank you guys. This was fun. Love you guys. Thanks you to anyone who's listening. This is episode number 2. We're just getting started. Subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe to the podcast and wherever you get them. And we'll see you next week.